as the country closely watched highly anticipated primary races in Kentucky and New York, Madison Cawthorn managed to pull off a massive insurgent victory in North Carolina's 11th district primary.
That's right. He defeated the handpicked choice by the president and his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, by over 30 points. And now the Republican Party wants the 24-year-old to be the voice of, quote, Zoomers in Congress. Madison joins us now via Skype for more on his victory and others things. Good to see you, Madison. Thanks for joining us.
Crystal Sager, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Absolutely. All right, so Madison, tell us a little bit about what you want to get done in Congress. You're going to be if elected, you'll be the youngest member of Congress in that body. You've talked a little bit about how you want to shake up the establishment and you actually want to get something done in the chamber. What does that mean to you? What are you looking to try and get done?
Well, first and foremost, whether you're talking about the Democratic side or the Republican side, I believe we have a lot of cowardly establishment hacks who really just try to toe their party line. They don't want to shake anything up in any real way. And, I almost look at them kind of like how, a lot of people see big healthcare. They don't necessarily want to fix the problems because then they're going to lose a lot of their clientele or, in this case, lose their talking points. So I want to go up to Washington, D.C. for some different reasons, not to enrich myself, not to empower myself, but to actually be a voice for the people of the United States, because I feel like we don't have that represented in Washington, D.C. right now.
Mm-hmm. And what do you attribute your victory to? I mean, it wasn't even close. You just absolutely dominated in a race that very much looked like it could go the other way, with President Trump throwing his support behind your opponent, even recording a robocall for her. What do you think made the difference?
I would say the biggest difference maker is what is lacking so much in Washington, D.C. today, and that's hard work. I had a team of about 6 of my best friends fly in from all over the country. We put in 18-hour days for about 6 months, and we refused to stop. And so I genuinely believe that, it's the hard work that made the difference. We went out and we thought that every single vote was the vote that could win the election for us. So we fought tooth and nail for every single person. And I think the people of Western North Carolina really appreciated having somebody who cared so much about them.
Mm-hmm. And Madison, I think one of the things that the national media hasn't necessarily told is really your own story about how you came to want to run for Congress and your own, and your own life. Tell us about that. What is it that inspired you to run for this?
So the first thing that made me want to run so much for Congress is, in 2016, when the Republicans held the House, the Senate, and we had the presidency, I genuinely believed we were going to see some sweeping changes, right? In my mind, a constitutional republic was just going to come roaring back. But I'm sure you, just like me, were very disappointed in the Republican establishment because it felt like Donald Trump was having to try and pull teeth from Congress to try and get anything done. And so I want to go up to Washington, D.C. to break that status quo, to actually get something done. But, where I really come from and why I'm wanting to run for Congress at this age is, in the very beginning of this election, we started in late December and early January. We were saying that this country is going in the wrong direction. And it was a great talking point because I genuinely believed it. But now we see over the past few months exactly where that direction is leading us. And, when you look at all of these states that are ran by Democratic governors who are just shutting the states down, trampling on First Amendment rights, and then just kind of ruling by fear and with an iron fist, regardless of the state's constitutions, I genuinely believe we need to have principled leaders who are going to go to Washington, D.C., who don't mind taking some hits in the media, who don't mind taking some unpopular stances. Because if we don't start fighting for our country right now, the very identity of it could be changed. And that's something that truly scares me.
Madison, what do you think of the coronavirus response at the federal level, both in terms of dealing with the pandemic, but something we talk a lot about here is the economic response? I mean, if you look over to Europe, they effectively nationalized payrolls. It's something that, Josh Hawley on the Republican side and Pramila Jayapal and others on the Democratic side have talked about doing here. It's not what we did. And so in Europe, they've had barely any increase in unemployment. People have stayed attached to their jobs. Of course, they have single-payer health care in a lot of countries, so they don't have to worry about not having health insurance during a pandemic. Here we took a very different approach, and as a result, we've had skyrocketing unemployment and deep uncertainty in the economy that has really left a lot of people struggling. Do you think that the approach we took was the right one? How would you have handled things differently? And are there partners across the aisle that you would like to work with on such things?
You know what? I think our approach, in the very beginning, when we heard how many millions of Americans could potentially die from this approach, was the right one. I mean, I completely understand logistical concerns that hospitals had of not having, whether it's PPE capacity or ventilator capacity. So I completely understood the government asking us to shut our doors to help our fellow man, so that we could help flatten the curve and there wouldn't be such a rise in hospitalizations, which would have caused more deaths. And so I was more than happy to shut down our country, for 2 weeks, 4 weeks. But then as that continued to go on for what seemed, I believe, around 3 months, I think that was an overreaction. We could have opened up our country a little bit sooner with a more of a structured reopening of our economy. Because so many people act like it was a binary choice between whether it was saving human lives or saving American jobs. But I feel like we could have more sooner in the process started a binary, a structured reopening of our economy to help protect the people who are most vulnerable, people that are over the age of 65, or people that have pre-existing conditions like myself, but while allowing normal Americans to be able to get back to work. Yeah. But I was a fan of the PPP protection plan, where we were able to keep a lot of people on payroll. And what happened in Europe was actually very effective, as you were just talking about, Crystal. But the problem we have here in the United States is our deep amount of national debt. This is why it's so imperative that we are able to have a balanced budget, so we are not saddled with such a heavy burden to carry around. So when we are faced with an economic crisis like we're in right now, we can respond with agility and quickly that would be able to help the American people without worrying about the long-term effects of it. Because now, with it, we're already $26 trillion in debt. There's very little that our federal government can actually afford to do.
And Madison, I know that one of the things that you've been very animated about is about going after opioid producers and mention that. Could you talk just a little bit about that and how it affects your district?
Absolutely. So there's a ginormous problem in our country right now from big pharma of just overdosing patients, and not necessarily overdosing, but overprescribing patients with opiate painkillers. And I know this a firsthand account of this. After I was in a terrible car accident in 2014, I was in the hospital for over a year. And so I had a pump in my arm whenever I'd go to bed. I could just press a button and have instant pain relief whenever I wanted it. And so when I came out of the hospital, they gave me this prescription of 300 pills of oxycodone or however much it was. I realized what a problem Big Pharma was playing in our country. With all of these, with these ginormous prescriptions being doled out to these patients who have, in all seriousness, really been hooked on these drugs in these hospitals. I believe that it makes the opioid crisis that's going on in our country so real. It specifically affects people in my district because this is such a hub between Atlanta, Charlotte, and Tennessee for a lot of different drug trafficking to happen here in Western North Carolina. And so we see a lot of opiate painkiller abuse in my district, but that's something that we need to attack head on. I know firsthand how dangerous it can be and how hard it is to get off. And so I'm very thankful I had a great support system from my doctors and from my older brother to really help me get off of these opiate painkillers. Because if not, my mind would be so foggy today, I would not have been in a place to be able to run for Congress and to be able to save my country.
And Madison, the Republican Party is hoping you can reach out to Zoomers, a group that, frankly, they're not doing too well with. And we see how the youngest generation, both millennials, but even more so Zoomers, really overwhelmingly backed Bernie Sanders and, tend to have a more favorable view of socialism than capitalism. So do you think that you're reflective of your generation? Do you think you really speak to your generation when you have so many conservative views, not just on social issues, but on fiscal issues as well?
I genuinely do. I know that the polling suggests that my generation is overwhelmingly left-leaning, but I believe that the problem with it has been is the fault lies with the Republican Party. For so long, they've just had a poor messaging stance, and we've chosen these social issue hills to die on, which I think has really created an alienation of who would be Republicans, whereas the majority of my generation is filing undecided or unaffiliated. They don't think that the Democratic Party necessarily represents them, and they definitely don't think the Republican Party represents them. And so, I believe that if we come out with a limited government approach, which is the true cause of conservatism, one that says, hey, I want the government to get out of your life, I want fiscal responsibility, I want strong border protection, and I want a strong military, I think a lot of our generation can get behind that. Let's get the government out of these social issues and social squabbles where they don't belong, and let's let state governments handle that individually. But as a from a federal perspective, Let's just focus on keeping people safe and building the framework for people to be able to thrive in their work and in their private lives.
Well, Madison, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it, man.
Great to have your perspective today, Madison. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Coming up, a Boeing executive resigned over a 30-year-old article on women in combat. Our thoughts on all of that when Rising returns.